Okay. So I'm going to be talking about, thank you. This is only my second time giving a talk. So I'm going to talk about the period before desktop publishing and the democratization of typesetting methods. And my interest in the democratization of typesetting comes from two places. The first being a long connection I've had to the independent publishing world. So I discovered zines in my 20s, my early 20s, and by my mid to late 20s, I was hired as the art director at Bitch Magazine in the Bay Area in California. And while I was there, I became intimately aware with the costs and the tribulations and also the rewards of publishing content that didn't have a lot of money to back it up. So we had to get creative at that time. We had a printer that wasn't a PostScript printer to print our proofs. I don't know how we did it. So that's one thing. The other thing that brings me to this particular interest is a collection of out-of-date graphic design manuals that I had started accumulating in my weekly to monthly trips to charity shops, the Goodwill being my preferred shop in the States. And I would just look at these step-by-step illustrations and photographs explaining processes that I missed in my own education by about 8 to 10 years, depending on who you talk to or where you were. So this talk is a marriage of these two loves, independent media and graphic design production before the desktop computer. And I want to note that this is a 20-minute talk, so it's not an exhaustive history, and it's going to focus particularly on the middle of the 20th century, not so much on hot type. And then finally, before I continue, I just want to note that I'm giving you a trigger warning for any of you who actually worked in these methods. Some of you really don't like to be reminded of it, but if it brings back happy memories, then I'll take credit for that. So right now, we're living in an incredibly, in a time where access to tools for sharing your ideas is pretty easy, and everything from desktop publishing to blogs to Twitter to Tumblr. Not just publishing professionals, but any person, a 10-year-old with an iPad can get their ideas out into the world. But as we know here, it hasn't always been that easy. In the grand scheme of us as humans, this is a fairly recent occurrence, from relief prints in China to the Bibles of Gutenberg. Printed matter was something that was accessible to those people with means, and the cost of preparing it and the cost of purchasing it, you both required having the finances to back that up. So let's fast forward now to strike-on technology, which really just means typewriters. Our story begins with newspapers, and it was really the newspaper industry that pushed typesetting technology forward. There was no grand sort of idea except that they didn't want to rely on union printers who were starting to strike, had been striking for quite a lot of time. And this was costing the newspapers. And they started subbing in non-union workers, who were often women, to compose the papers on strike-on machines, which were, like I said, essentially typewriters, a little bit fancier than typewriters. So let's look at some of those. This is a sort of the dawn of the cold type era, meaning that type that was set without using hot metal type. And most people think of phototypography as cold type, but some would say that strike-on fits in that category as well. So the Frieden Justerwriter was one of these systems, and the type would be entered into a recording machine, and then punch tape would come out, which would then be entered into a reproducer, which would output camera-ready type with proportional spacing and justified text. It wasn't as good looking, but it got the job done. Another machine used by small papers, we're not talking New York Times here, was the IBM Executive. I mean, this was also used in offices as well. And it offered quasi-proportional spacing. Here's a later one. It offered justification, albeit with some steps involved. I'll show you an image in a minute. But here from their manual, you can see that they're explaining why, to a user who's maybe using it in an office, why this proportional type is superior. And here's a little illustration of what went into justifying the type. Another machine that was used was the Fairchild lithotype composer. And they advertised 6 to 12, a large number of faces and proportional character spacing and justification with a standard typewriter keyboard. So someone who wasn't in the union or didn't have that training could use it. The Verityper was another machine, and they were really going for advertising the faces that were available. And I just like to think that this ad was kind of a wink to the fact that the machine looks like a face. The woman typing on the machine just gets me every time because it looks like she's typing on his teeth. And here's an example of it looks like a happy creature. This is what the font looked like, and you would just snap those in and out to change your typeface. You can see the scale of it there compared to the machine. Verityper also created this other machine called the Coxhead composing machine. And then lastly, the machine that kind of won the strike-on competition, as it were, was the IBM Selectric composer. So many of you probably have worked with an IBM Selectric, and then the composer was a machine that offered even more control over typesetting. This was released in 1961, but we'll get back to that. So the cold typesetting revolution. While strike-on systems were gaining in use, the cold type revolution was gaining steam. The machines could utilize fonts existing in film formats. They would project light through the film to expose the letter photographically, hence the term photo typesetting or photo setting. And this revolution was very brief in the grand scheme of design and type as a discipline, but it burned pretty brightly, and it led the way for a lot of design styles and development. From a typographic design perspective, the period was most notable for encouraging a huge proliferation of typeface designs to land on the market due to more affordable manufacturing and storage of those faces. Just so you can get a sense of what those fonts look like, these are some examples from different machines, either on, again, film, glass, or plastic. And ultimately, designers or typesetters could have more control in spacing, whether it was letter spacing, line spacing, or for display type kerning, which of course led to experimentation of super tightly set type. This would have been done with paste up, but at any rate, the technology led to that kind of thinking that wasn't really even possible before, except for if it had been lettered, by the way, our previous speaker. So the printing industry had begun this transition to phototype in 1949 with the introduction of the photon photosetter, but the machines were massive and they were super expensive. So this one went for $62,000. The first one went for $82,000. And that's not even including typefaces. So it's a big investment. Anyone wanting to reproduce a pamphlet or publication with decent quality typography would have to take their manuscript to a type shop to be typeset by professionals. Activists or small presses, artists, and small organizations like churches and schools and small businesses often resorted to typewritten copy simply because they couldn't afford that and would just reproduce with a mimeograph. So back to the Selectric Composer. What looks like a typewriter at first glance was really actually a very powerful machine which allowed users to change typefaces and control letter spacing, justify lines of type. And of course, the IBM executive that we saw before had those features, but the Selectric Composer offered those at a better quality, easier to do, and better reproduction quality. I want to see if this is a video. Okay. So here's an example of, this is my IBM Selectric. It's not a composer, so it's just a typewriter. You can see it's a pretty sexy machine with that golf ball font. That was when I was first getting comfortable using it. So an organization, a small business, could lease an IBM Selectric for about $150 a month, which was a fraction of what typesetting fees might cost for one issue of a magazine. And then they could sporadically purchase dry transfer lettering for special, display type or subheads. And with those two things, they could produce pretty professional level type. I mean, depending on their knowledge of typesetting and design, they were powerful tools. Here's some examples of specimens. I was going to say my talk was specimen free too, but it isn't. These are some specimens for the IBM Selectric, and you can see they're set justified. They had a ruling font as well, which I think most designers of the time would skip that and just do it with a rapidograph, but maybe if you're on a time crunch, this is something you might use. And eventually the systems had data storage, which meant that instead of entering in your type twice, you could enter it in once and get have a magnetic tape remember what you wrote and put that into a machine to output. So Stuart Brand, who is the publisher of the Whole Earth catalog, which started in the 1960s, was a big fan of the Selectric. This is just an example of a spread, and if you're not familiar with the Whole Earth catalog, it was basically either a reference or a mail order catalog, depending on what entry you were looking in, for people who are wanting to use technology as a way to sort of live outside of the mainstream sphere. Sort of a hippie, techno-hippie guidebook, really. And he loved the Selectric because it allowed him to produce this catalog. This is a little article about how to do your own Whole Earth catalog. Speaking of sharing ideas, most of the people doing these kinds of publishing projects were all about sharing their ideas and their methods so that other people would keep those ideas flowing. Whoops. Well, so dry transfer type, which a lot of people would just refer to as Letraset in the same way that we call Kleenex, we call tissue Kleenex. But Letraset came out I think in the late 50s, but really hit its stride in the 60s, and offered a lot of ways to set display type and eventually uses for other kinds of uses as well. And there were many competing brands as well, like Zipatone, Chartpak, Decadry. And originally it was intended for the use of professional designers, but eventually they caught on as a company and realized that lots of people were using this stuff for various applications here. We've got a kid doing a model plane to a marketing guy with his sales chart. And I find really interesting the uses of people who, so these are artists using Letraset to create small publications, what I would call a zine now in my age, but these little publications, allowing them to have decent type. I mean, these are designed by artists, so maybe not hitting our standards, but. Or maybe you had a business that would have trouble getting typesetting, or you didn't have enough money to get typesetting, or you thought someone was going to be prejudiced about the content that you were trying to typeset. And of course, one of the best known uses of dry transfer lettering was by punk bands in the 70s. and they just went to town, most, in flyers and things like that. I tried to determine if this Sex Pistols album was set with dry transfer, and it isn't. There's a lot of cut and paste from pre-printed materials, so I'm learning to decipher those things. So for the more advanced user, there were machines that were for sale that allowed for the setting of display type on usually on film strips. So the first one was the Filmotype, which came out in 1959. You can see looks like a film that would go in a projector. The Phototypositor was probably the most beloved and most flexible and robust machine out there. And you can see she's looking into a viewfinder so she can watch as each letter form develops in a bath of chemicals that are built right into the machine. And you could set your type on a number of substrates. This introduced, much to probably a lot of type designers' horrors, tricks that you could do, whether it was creating italics or stretching type, putting type on a curve, things like that. They were advertising it as a machine that will essentially replace your lettering artist, which we know is not the case, not possible. But they're saying $15 a week, 24 hours a day, year-round, for your typositor. Another machine was the ProType, which sold for $600. Sorry, the typositor was $2,400. So much cheaper was the ProType. Yeah, you want to. The ProType offered, $600 a display type, and then even cheaper was the strip printer, and this was their whole campaign was, we're cheap and flexible. Look what you can do. You don't lease our machine. For just $329, you get all of this. You get, I think, 10 typefaces. And then Verityper made a headlining machine as well, which, as you can see, theirs was a little different. It was on a plastic disc. So they're advertising here that you could have a complete composing room with not taking up that much space, with the Verityper for body type and the headliner for display type. So, these kinds of affordable typesetting tools were perfect for the counterculture that was exploding at the time in the 60s and 70s. So I just want to show you some examples of these tools in use. This is a magazine called Amazon Quarterly, a feminist magazine, and they're using, I think, probably a Selectric, and this is an article telling you how to make your own magazine. It's showing you, I think that's a waxer, perhaps, there. Here there's always a lot of mixture of lettering with, type maybe set with a Selectric, and then dry transfer type, like on the right of the Great Speckled Bird cover. They're using a mixture of everything there. And it creates this really sort of unique aesthetic of that's very much of that era, and very, maybe not as refined as what we are accustomed to now, but I think there's something really vibrant about it, and it's like coming from the heart and coming from the core of these movements. Gay publications were able to publish perhaps more than they were in the past. Again, feminist publications off our backs, which went on for quite a long time, that publication, and publishing important content that maybe was harder to find elsewhere. Tooth and Nail, this is just a really simple one that I love. It's clearly made by someone who's probably not a designer, and there's something simple and elegant about it. And then there was some pretty experimental use of dry transfer, and pair that with color, and it really comes to life. And this would cost thousands if you were to try and do this with photo typesetting and pay a typesetter to do it. That same magazine also offered their typesetting services. So you could send them your manuscript, and they would set it for you, and this is their little ad telling you, we can do it like this, we can do it like this, we can do it like this. Just send it to us, and we'll send it back to you. Another publication, Radical Software, which was concerned with ideas of getting your content out through, actually through video. It sounds like it's about software as we think of it now, but it's actually video. Political publications, and just using what they had. So here on these 2 pages, we've got dry transfer type, we've got a hand-drawn map, we've got a photograph, we've got typeset with probably a Selectric, and then typeset with just a regular typewriter. Oz was one of the most dynamic magazines coming out at this time, and originally out of Australia, but eventually moved to the UK. And they were using a lot of these tools. I think they had a little bit more money, but just a really exuberant use of all these tools that they had on hand that were not super, they're not spending loads of money to make a spread like this. Very cheeky magazine. And they went through obscenity trials and everything. They were always causing trouble. Another magazine or publication that ran on a shoestring and was set with a Selectric was the Black Panther newspaper, which was designed by Emory Douglas. And he managed to mix his really bold and stirring illustrations with what we would consider fairly crude typesetting, but he certainly got the energy of that movement across. And again, he's communicating what are really effectively like life and death ideas that they wouldn't have been able to afford that as an organization without. And so eventually we come to a period where there is affordable photo settings. So instead of a strike-on, we can, and instead of something like a Linotron 505, which ran $103,000 to $146,000, and look at the size of that thing, it's a beast. There were all these new machines on the market, and this at one point there were more than 300. A little bit overwhelming if you can imagine. Now you go, I want a Mac or a PC, but in this period, you had to look through a chart that looked like this. And there's my little iMagazine for scale. That's how big this poster is, explaining those. So here are some of the affordable ones. The CompuWriter, $5,500 to $20,000, or the Linocomp, $8,700 to $26,000. And there you've got Charles Darwin there to show you about the evolution of typesetting. The VIP was another, Mergenthaler VIP was another machine, and that was about $11,000 to $19,000. And even if that was too much money, there were often used ones on the market because people were upgrading. There were these little upgrades happening all the time, so you could go and find a used one. Also, there were leasing options, which a lot of people did. So the ability to set even finer type became accessible to people who didn't have a huge amount of money to put down. But, of course, it wasn't long after that that a new machine landed on the market and changed the face of the industry, and we know that's another story. And I just thought I'd leave you with these famous words from Stuart Brand: stay hungry and stay foolish. For those of us who have a passion for independent publishing, these words will never cease to be relevant. And if you stick around, I'm doing a screening of a work in progress of my film, Graphic Means. This talk was just a seed from a moment in the film, really. The film is mostly about the development of photo typesetting and then the transition to digital. So I'd love if you can stick around and watch the film. I've got some forms for feedback. If you are so inclined, you can also email me with feedback. And I hope you can stick around and watch Graphic Means.